Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello there, welcome again to this ongoing discussion on Indian drama. Last class, of course, before we begin with Indian English drama, let us quickly recap what we did in the previous class. We began with Bharata's Natya Shastra and how Natya Shastra proposes a distinct rasa theory. We identified the Navarasas and how the dramatic performances or performative arts in general can also be called rasabhinaya based on their ability to evoke certain rasa in the audience, and how modern psychology also makes use of these various rasas. We discussed all of them, and we also discussed major Sanskrit dramatists in Kalidasa, Bhasa, Ashwaghosha, Shudraka, Vishakadatta and others. So, we began our discussion of these playwrights with Kalidasa. So, in this class we discuss another major playwright, Bhasa, and probably after that we can go to Indian English drama. Okay, we can trace the origins of Indian English drama generally to folk theatre, and we can begin from there after discussing Bhasa. All right. So, here is Bhasa. Generally Bhasa is another important playwright who predates Kalidasa. You have of course Ashwaghosha too. We have identified Ashwaghosha as probably the first playwright. Remember, this is based on an intelligent academic guesswork, right, because unfortunately we do not have any important plays that Ashwaghosha seemed to have written, though we find references to that in some of his contemporaries' works. Bhasas, his of course like Kalidasa and Ashwaghosha to a certain extent, Bhasa too borrows his plots from Mahabharata, especially his Madhyama Vyayoga and Urubhanga. They are of course his well known plays. They are borrowed on they are taken from Mahabharata, especially Urubhanga discusses the last the last battle between Duryodhana and Bhima. Very beautiful rendition of some of these wonderful sub themes from the Mahabharata. Okay. And well, it is said that Bhasa did not have much regard for Bharata's Natya Shastra. Therefore, many of them consider Bhasa to even predate Bharata, right. But again, as we said, there are no solid historical proofs for us to argue that Bhasa existed before Bharata. These are some things that can be kept in mind. Remember, we also have Shudraka, Mruchakatika, especially the little clay cart, along with Shakuntala. Mruchakatika is also another well known or very important Sanskrit play that many of us may have heard of, Shudraka. When it comes to the second generation or the later playwrights of Sanskrit, you have Bhavabhuti, especially Uttara Ramacharita and all that. Well, for want of space and time, again we are not discussing all of them. So, from Sanskrit drama, let us move on to what triggered Indian English drama. Of course, the only step before that is Indian folk theatre. We need to identify Indian folk theatre. We have identified that Sanskrit drama declined after 11th century. So, probably by the time it is 15th, 16th century, Sanskrit drama as we understand it almost dried up. The essence of Sanskrit drama begins flowing in the regional languages. That is why you have some extraordinary and very rich theatre traditions, dramatic traditions in many of our regional languages. Okay. And in the meanwhile, sometime towards the end of 18th century or some mid 19th century, You have folk theatre emerging in various parts of the subcontinent, that add the rural touch, the religious and the rural touch to the drama as such. So, as part of that folk dramatic tradition, it has a diverse branching, So, in Bengal you find folk theatre in the form of jatra, and in Gujarat they call it bhavai, Nautanki in Uttar Pradesh, Tamasha in Maharashtra, Yakshagana in Karnataka, and all these things. So, you find the emergence of folk dramatic traditions in regional flavors, in the flavors of bhashas. So, accordingly you find all these variations there. So, this is something that can be kept in mind, and this folk theatre provided of course a rich playground for Indian English drama to trace its roots, and from there you can discuss the origins of Indian English drama from there. But an important offshooting of folk theatre is commercial theatre. So, commercial theatre makes use of the makeshift stages. In fact, these are not full-fledged stages or theatres. Remember, usually they were performed during various religious festivals, maybe using the makeshift ground of various government schools or village fairgrounds and all that. So, this is how commercial theatre ran. So, when you talk of Indian folk theatre, another important, they are all touring groups, they are all travelling groups. In fact, these folk theatres, they went on travelling across the regions in which they were located, from place to place. Maybe when they come up, when they take up a play, they perform it, they identify 4 to 5 different centres, and they go there and perform it, perform it there maybe for about let us say 20 shows, 30 shows, and afterwards once the number of shows are exhausted, they go to some other city and identify another makeshift stage and start performing there. So, these are something that that can be found in folk theatre. Well, during the anti-colonial times, of course, folk theatre also acted as a great a great tool in the hands of anti-colonial theoretical things, because remember what happens is theatre was also, like literature, theatre was also predominantly used by many well-known thinkers to ignite nationalist consciousness. Therefore, you also find folk theatre contributing to furthering the national consciousness in India, So, these are some things that we can of course keep in mind. Now, when it comes to Indian English drama, we have already identified that folk theatre is a kind of, it provides a rich cornucopia out of which Indian English drama also emerges. But Indian English drama, with the Indian English drama, you have the Greek proscenium stage appearing here. In fact, remember, Indian English drama itself is a product of certain class. We have already identified while discussing Indian English poetry, right, that the people who write in Indian English, whether it's poetry or drama, they belong to certain class, they belong to certain background. Therefore, by virtue of their exposure to the West, they know how to, they are aware, they are absolutely aware of the theatre traditions of the West. Therefore, you find proscenium stage getting introduced into India there, which was absolutely not there in folk theatre. That is something that can be kept in mind. Of course, you have various Victorian ethos elements like realism, because that was the time when these Indian English playwrights also were aware of plays written by George Bernard Shaw, plays written by Henrik Ibsen. They had an active understanding of European drama, and more than that, Shakespearean drama and Greek drama too. Therefore, you can find influences of all those rich, diverse dramatic traditions in Indian English drama. So, these are some things that we can keep in mind. Okay, this is when it comes to early Indian English dramatists. In fact, remember, the very genre Indian English drama is slightly problematic, because like you have a distinct Indian English poetry tradition, you have Indian English fiction tradition, we do not have a very distinct Indian English drama. In fact, most of the times when we say Indian English drama, all that we deal with are plays written in regional languages. That is the reason why if you ask any student of literature to name Indian English playwrights, all that they can come up with is Girish Karnad, Badal Sarkar, and Vijay Tendulkar. Interestingly, all of them wrote in their regional languages, and their plays were later translated into English, but today of course we consider them as part of Indian English drama. So, as such it is a slightly on a tenacious identity. Indian English drama has it does not have the kind of solid identity that Indian English poetry has or Indian English fiction has. So, that can be kept in mind. So, during the colonial times we have Michael Madhusudan Dutt. In fact, we have discussed Michael Madhusudan Dutt in a rather detailed manner while discussing Indian English poetry. Recall, he is also called the father of Bengal Renaissance, So, again he plays a major role in reviving dramatic tradition. So, you have this is called Civilization, kind of the first Indian English play that you can call off, written in 1871. From there you have even Sri Aurobindo also experiments in Indian English drama, and you have Harindranath Chattopadhyaya, T.P. Kailasam again, who wrote in Kannada. His T.P. Kailasam is a very major name in Kannada dramatic tradition, but he has also written a couple of English plays. You have Loba Prabhu and Bharti Sarabhai, these are some names. But until it was not until Tagore that modern Indian drama got the kind of recognition it deserved. Therefore, we go to discuss Tagore. In fact, even in case of Tagore, he wrote in Bangla, and many of the maybe most of his plays were translated by others. Maybe he must have also contributed to the translation of the play. But Rabindranath Tagore is a significant name when it comes to Indian English drama, and Tagore was greatly influenced by by the dramatic works of Kalidasa. Therefore, in many of his works he recalls the contribution of Kalidasa and even Bharata's Natyashastra. That is why even while discussing Natyashastra we discussed Tagore's opinion on that particular plays. So, and Tagore also talks about he was aware, of course, being exposed to Western tradition and both the Eastern tradition, he was aware of the pros and cons of both Indian drama and Western drama. In an article that he wrote in Bangla called Natya Manch, he seemed to discuss the embellishment, the excessive importance given to embellishment, especially in the form of rich stage props, rich stage employed in Western drama, and somehow come to favor the Indian folk drama, because there because he for one, as a playwright, he did not really approve of the kind of division that existed in the Western drama, because remember, when you talk of a proscenium stage, there is a there is a kind of a gap between the audience and the stage, whereas in most of our Indian folk theatre, folk dramatic traditions, you do not make use of that kind of a gap between the audience. In fact, most of our plays begin from the middle of the audience, right. So, therefore, he seemed to have favored that, he seemed to have favored that kind of an elegant simple stage, whereas the message needs to reach, because he believed that if the divide, when there is a divide between the audience and the stage, well, it may create a distance even in terms of the emotions the play exuberates, there may be a kind of a gap. On the other hand, when there is no gap between the audience and the stage, probably the effect is a little more, something like that. You have some well known plays by Rabindranath Tagore called Valmiki Pratibha. In fact, that is supposed to be his first play, written in 1881, Valmiki's Genius. Valmiki Pratibha is supposed to be his first play. and he seemed to have written more than 25-30 plays, probably many more than that. And sometimes it so happened that some of his works have also been turned into plays. Some of his works have been turned into plays. Some of his well known plays include Rokto Karabi, Red Oleanders, and it is also called Blood Oleanders depending on the translation. And you have some solid female protagonists in many of his plays, including Malini, Chitrangada, Natir Puja, Muktadhara and Chandalika, especially Chandalika, which is a dance drama. Probably it must have come towards the end of his dramatic tradition, dramatic writing, so in 1938, and of course Chandalika is one of his well read plays in translation even to this day, a major figure as far as Indian English drama is concerned. Of course, even for Indian English poetry, his contribution is immense. We have discussed Rabindranath Tagore too in great detail while discussing Indian English poetry. So, now from the pre-colonial times, in fact, the first step towards discussing theatre in the post-independent stage is Bombay Parsi theatre. The Bombay Parsi theatre played a major role in the birth of Indian English drama because by the end of 19th century, these wealthy, affluent Parsi business community, they bought a few theatre establishments, because remember, the British were almost packing up, they were almost packing up. Therefore, they purchased certain theatre establishments from British and began staging modern plays there. Of course, the express concern was to educate the local population, and of course to they used it in order to in their zeal to reform society, in order to weed out certain social evils such as dowry, child marriage, gambling, addiction and all that. They made use of theatre. Therefore, theatre was pressed into the service of social transformation, you could call it. And of course, there in Bombay you have Grant Road Theatre in Old Bombay, that also plays a very major role in establishing Indian English drama. These are a few stops that we need to make in order to understand the roots or the moorings of Indian English drama as such. Now, I already said that Indian English drama, when we say, we invariably think of Vijay Tendulkar, Girish Karnad, Badal Sarkar, Asif Karimbai and of course Mahesh Dattani and others. So, out of these 5-6 names that I have taken, only 1 or 2 of them wrote actually in English, right. The rest of them, whether it is Karnad, who is a Gyanpith awardee and a very well known Indian English dramatist, or even Vijay Tendulkar and Badal Sarkar too, they are extraordinary names in Indian English drama. They basically wrote in regional languages, and they find a place in Indian English because they through translations. When it comes to Karnad, he translated most of his plays himself into English, and he did some extraordinary experimentation there. In fact, he changed a lot of things, and from there, when he went to revising his works in Kannada, he brought in the changes that he made while translating them into English. So, it was a kind of a very dynamic drama making or playwriting that Karnad did. Vijay Tendulkar, again a very important name, recipient of Padma Bhushan Award, Sangeet Natak Academy Award, Sangeet Natak Fellowship, he also is the recipient of the fellowship. These are very important awards considering the recognition and recognizing that contribution of the playwright. Government of India almost honored him with Padma Bhushan and all that. Vijay Tendulkar, it is said that has about 30 approximately full length plays, but he wrote all of them in Marathi, and many of them, if not all of them, most of them were translated later into English. Vijay Tendulkar is known for mixing his strong political views in his plays. In other words, Tendulkar used his plays to further his secular credentials, in order to further his secular political themes. He used his plays. Therefore, you can say that his plays are a radical literary spaces through which he highlights on the plural fabric that defines our country. Some of his well known plays include Silence, the court is in session, that is his English translation. It was in Marathi, it was called Shantata Court Chalu Ahe. And then you have Sakharam Binder, written in 72, and Ghasiram Kotwal almost during the same time. Both of them have also been translated into English, very important playwright when it comes to Indian English drama. We have Badal Sarkar here writing almost during the same time, but here in Bengal, Again, a very important playwright, recipient of Padma Shri Award, again bestowed with Sangeet Natak Fellowship, Sangeet Natak Academy Award as well. In case of Badal Sarkar, again he used theatre to further his radical views of theatre. In fact, he considered he almost proposed a new form of theatre called the third theatre. He called it the third theatre. The first theatre being Sanskrit theatre, he called it the first theatre. The folk theatre is the second theatre, and of course that is why his views on theatre were slightly different from though they were closer to folk theatre. He further stretched the unconventionalities of folk theatre and proposed a new form of theatre movement called third theatre. And generally it is considered today as an emancipatory cultural institution, because the way it brought audience or people closer to drama, or drama closer to people, and it involves various production techniques and performative techniques and all that. These are some of his contributions to Indian English, especially to theatre. So, when it comes to his plays, Evam Indrajit is considered a remarkable play, written in 1963. Remember, he is a very prolific playwright, Badal Sarkar. More than 50 plays are, he is credited with more than 50 plays. Some of his other plays, apart from Evam Indrajit, are, Basi Khabar and Sari Roth. These are some of his other well known plays. So, these are some major playwrights that we can keep in mind. Of course, Girish Karnad we are going to discuss in detail while we are discussing his play. I said that we are going to take up Girish Karnad's Hayavadana for a detailed discussion. So, therefore, during that time we can think of it. So, I am slightly skipping all these important names. We have stalwarts like Habib Tanveer, Utpal Dutt and Safdar Hashmi, who play a major role in especially popularizing street theatre and all that. Then you have a contribution of Indian People's Theatre Association that again brings theatre closer to people, the masses. Mahesh Dattani and probably you have the recent Manjula Padmanabhan. These are very well known playwrights who actually wrote in English. So, in a very technical sense, you can call Mahesh Dattani an original Indian English playwright, of course original in quote, without of course discounting the importance of playwrights like Badal Sarkar and others, because they actually write, they are not translations as such, but he writes in English. Mahesh Dattani works basically in the broad areas of ushering in gender consciousness and sexuality, masculinity, femininity, communalism and all that. These are some kind of keywords that you can find in his plays. And one of the very well known playwrights, especially his Dance Like a Man, written in 1989, is one of the well read plays. In fact, the moment you talk of Indian English drama like Girish Karnad's Tughlaq, Dance Like a Man is very well discussed. Again, here he tries to break the gender stereotypes. Here here is the protagonist who is very much interested in drama, but his father opposes him. He thinks that drama and dance, especially these are for women. So, the moment by virtue of practicing dance, it makes a man effeminate. That is a kind of, this is for his father considers himself a very progressive individual. So, all this for in the name of progressive thinking. So, the kind of troubles our protagonist faces in the hands of his father and society at large forms the crux of Dance Like a Man. Again, Tara discusses gender stereotypes and how you have the story of a conjoined twins in Tara, and how when the twin is separated, how they are separated in such a way that the boy survives and the girl dies, and now the boy has to live through the guilt, and of course it ends in a very tragic way. Some of his other well known plays include Final Solutions, Bravely Fought the Queen and others. Okay. And afterwards we have another important name, Manjula Padmanabhan. Of course, she is a very important name because she won the well known Onassis Award, a very a big international award, Onassis Award, for her work Harvests. Almost a kind of a futuristic play, makes use of various technological advancements and all that. Again, discusses gender stereotypes and the gaps between the third world and the first world, very many other things, the concept of sexuality. These are some of the concerns in the play. So, this is in general Indian English drama, kind of a again a bird's eye view of Indian English drama. Okay. So, I hope you enjoyed this class. In the next class, we come up with a detailed discussion of Hayavadana and Girish Karnad. In the meanwhile, please pick up the play and start reading. I am sure you will enjoy that. All right. See you in the next class.